Join us now in today's Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Barbara Holmes, host for this program in the Austin Faith Dialogue series, brought to you by the Austin Area Conference of Churches in cooperation with KTBC. Today's program deals with some of the concerns involved in what we call the peace issue. There's a wide range of opinions about nuclear weapons, arms reduction, military spending, national defense, within the religious community as well as the community at large. In this theological journal, Interpretation, the editor states that while politicians agree that peace is desirable, and those of a religious orientation agree that peace is the will of God, there is rampant disagreement on how such peace is to be defined, let alone accomplished. Yet, such disagreement dare not be used by Christians as an excuse to cease reflection on the nature of peace or to abandon the search for scriptural light on the problem of how it is to be established. We think this is an appropriate context for the dialogue today and the perspective of our guests, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. This is Mary Berwick, a Catholic laywoman who spends a lot of her time with peace groups, and we're glad to have you, Mary. And Tom, welcome. Tom Griffey, a scientist by nature and an active United Methodist layman. So perhaps we really ought to start our dialogue by seeing if we can agree or come to a definition of what peace is. Tom, what definition would you give of peace?
According to the Bible, the word that we use as peace started out as the Hebrew word shalom, and it meant much more than an absence of conflict. Shalom was everything that contributed to man's well-being, a happiness within the community, security, living to a ripe old age. All of those things are included in our idea of peace. Mm-hmm. And I think some of the passages quoted from the Bible in support of the so-called peace movement often overlook the fact that peace meant much more than an absence of conflict.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mary, let's turn to you now and see how you would define that.
Well, I would agree with all that Tom has said, and would add perhaps that peace in the biblical term is also part of a faithfulness to the covenant with God, first of all of the Israelites and then of ourselves as Christians. And I like to remember, when I'm reflecting on it, some lovely principles of peace that Pope John the 23rd in his encyclical Peace on Earth, Pacem in Terra, said. He used the 4 foundations of peace as being truth, justice, freedom, and love. And that in personal relations we should be truthful, seek justice, allow for our individual freedoms, and do everything in mutual charity. And that the very same thing should apply between nations and peoples.
Well, it sounds as if you all have are into this issue and have given it a lot of thought. Let's look a little deeper. Tom, you're a trained scientist. You've been trained in nuclear physics, and you sometimes serve as a consultant for the federal government on defense questions. And from your perspective, would you say that a strong national defense might be one of the best ways to reduce armed conflict and even lead us towards peace?
Reduction of armed conflict may not be our goal. If we really want to achieve peace, in the biblical sense of that word, it includes an idea of security, of well-being, of living within secure borders, of not having a chaotic situation. Often the willingness and the ability to defend things we hold dear contributes more to the biblical sense of peace than the avoidance of conflict. And so, yes, I would have to say that having a strong national defense is often necessary in order to avoid situations where peace in the biblical sense has been destroyed. Had England, for example, been willing to confront Hitler in the late 30s, we might have avoided the Holocaust that followed.
Well, before we get into some of those issues, let's go back and, Mary, as we talked about the definition of peace and kind of the context that you're working out of, talk a little bit about 1 or 2 of the groups that you're involved in. What are some of their goals?
Well, I'd mention first from my faith perspective as a Roman Catholic that I'm part of the International Catholic Peace Movement. I'm a member of Pax Christi, which is the International Catholic Peace Movement founded in the 1940s at the closing days of World War II. And we seek to obey Christ's call to be peacemakers and the gospel imperative of peacemaking. As Christians, it includes love of neighbor, but it also includes, as Christ said, love of enemies. And part of the goals of Pax Christi are disarmament and a just world order and alternatives to violence and education for peace and primacy of conscience. And then within, as well as that, within Austin, I'm a founder member of the Austin Peace and Justice Coalition, which includes about 29 various groups in the Austin area who have different agendas in their work toward improving social conditions or social justice.
So some of them have different goals and are working on different things.
Yes, but the prime agenda for the Peace and Justice Coalition is to end the arms race and to use resources for the crying human needs that there are, instead of spending them, overspending, we would see it on military hardware.
Well, recently, it seems as if there's been kind of an upsurge in peace groups and their activities. I think of in mid-March when a group of about 45 people went from Austin to the nuclear test site in Nevada. And back in January, Reverend William Sloan Coffin was here for a constituting convention of Texans working for peace with justice. And because he is known for his national prominence in peace activities and civil rights, we were very fortunate to tape an interview with him, and we're going to look at some excerpts from that tape. One of the co-hosts for this series, Richard Thompson, spent some time with Dr. Coffin. They talked a little bit specifically about why he was here in Austin. And then Rich asked him some questions, and I want us to hear this question where he talks about some of the things that he sees as important in the peace issue. So let's look at that tape now.
Everyone. Okay, so what you're into is not simply arms issues, but a variety of issues that kind of cluster together under what you might call peaceful resolution of conflict.
They do really cluster. I mean, the cost of the arms race, $2 trillion, just from what just talking about what President Reagan wants to spend, represents $30,000 per family in this country. Now, what you could do with $30,000 per family is terrific. What you can do with missiles is absolutely nothing except hope that the government will never use them. So we feel, I feel, is a very special moment. Gorbachev is on the scene. How rare it is in Soviet history that you get a reformer. And usually in Soviet and Russian history, after every reformation comes counter-reformation, and that's not an anti-Catholic statement. And if we don't cooperate with Gorbachev, who wants to reduce...
Do you sense that there is a new feeling? Are you under the impression or motivation that this is an unprecedented time in our history and we must grasp the moment?
Well, I hope it is a good time or a golden moment. I know certainly that people not only in the peace movement, but I think the public in general is learning something more about the Soviet Union, and there are many programs that we see on television of interchange and satellite programs, seeing Moscow or seeing people in Moscow or seeing the ordinary Soviet citizen as against the sort of, just the government leaders. And I know that many people, even in the Austin area, if we were to count them, they wouldn't fit in this room, have been recently to the Soviet Union under various auspices. Sometimes educational exchanges, cultural exchanges. There were a whole group of musicians from Texas that toured the Soviet Union last year.
There has been a lot of that recently, exchanges of all sorts. And there is no doubt about the visit of Mr. Gorbachev to this country, and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that was hammered out has been a very significant step in the direction of a better understanding between nations. Tom, I was interested by his definition of Mr. Gorbachev as a reformer. Do you hold the same opinion that perhaps this is a time where we might mutually reduce our armed forces. And I'd like to ask you, do you regard Mr. Gorbachev as a reformer? And what are some implications? Do you think the INF Treaty will be ratified?
Well, first of all, I think Gorbachev is serious about his reforms.
Yeah.
Perestroika is one example of that. His glasnost, we see far more of the Soviet Union, and perhaps more importantly, the Soviet citizens see far more of the Soviet Union than they've ever seen before. So yes, he is a serious reformer. Part of his reforms are economic. The Russian economy is in a shambles. And in order to cut back on defense expenditures, in order to help repair the economy, I believe Gorbachev is quite serious about arms reductions. I think the INF Treaty is the first example of that. And I think if we work hard and are both fortunate, that we will see strategic reduction treaties before the Reagan administration goes out of office. I think both leaders are quite serious in wanting this, and I think both countries would benefit from it.
Well, I know that here in Central Texas, we are heavily dependent on the economy that is due in part to some of the military-industrial complexes that are here. And this is a question that is also addressed on the tape, where talks about military spending and perhaps the reduction or conversion of military installations. And I'd like for us to go back and look again at part of the tape to hear Richard Thompson ask Reverend Coffin about military installations and conversion. So let's watch the tape.
This paper, just recently, there was a set of statistics that only one of which I'll quote from the Defense Department, that the defense industry in this area is represented by about $2.2 billion in expenditures. And that's up from $1.97 billion at the end of 1986. Texas as a whole, and this part of Texas in particular, is very closely connected and wired in to the industrial military complex.
Right.
We're dependent upon that for our economy.
That's right.
So the real question that has a local significance for us is, can we afford peace? In other words, how do you wean yourself away from that kind of dependence upon that industry for jobs?
Well, the first thing, of course, you have to say is that if there's a nuclear exchange, you will have cut off your nose to spite your face by hanging on to these industries because you had to hang on to your jobs. That's the first thing to say. It is understandable but inexcusable that people should argue, well, we have to keep the economy going, and that's why we have to be prepared for mega murder. I mean, the churches should never allow that kind of argument to stand, which is obviously what a nuclear exchange would represent. So that's the first thing you have to say. Then the second thing I think you have to say is a very practical thing, namely that the arms industry is the least efficient way to provide jobs. Because the arms industry, whether it's in Virginia, Southern California, or here in your Texas, is capital intensive rather than labor intensive. That is, our taxpayers' money, oodles of it, goes to supply jobs for very expensive, sophisticated machines.
All right, so
You spent that same $1 billion
right,
on firemen, on teachers, on policemen, a lot of whom you've had to lay off, no doubt, on helping farm workers, on helping the unemployed so you wouldn't have to pay unemployment benefits to them. This economy could thrive in a way it never has thriven, if that's the right word, never has thrived before. So to say that you need it for the sake of the economy is saying you need a lousy economy because you haven't got the imagination to come up with a better one.
Well, he doesn't exactly mince his words, does he? But as we look at that concept of the defense spending and military installations, in the news recently I read that some of the Soviet installations are converting to consumer products. Just recently I read that one of the military installations was now making baby carriages, and that another was manufacturing bicycles, and that they were manufacturing washing machines. And these things are probably very much needed in the Soviet economy. But as a concept, Tom, from your perspective and what you know about various military installations, is conversion a realistic possibility?
Well, first let me say I think the whole argument of saying that we need military expenditures to keep our economy going is rather far-fetched. As I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that Gorbachev is so interested in treaties is to reduce the expenditures on armaments in order to repair the economy. I don't think, nor does the administration believe, that we ought to spend one more dime on defense than is absolutely necessary to guarantee our security and that of our allies. Nor should we spend one dime less than what is required. Now, as to the question of conversion, ironically enough, as the weapon systems become more complex, the question of conversion becomes more real. As when one was making cannonballs, it's kind of hard to turn a cannonball into something of practical use. However, if you look at our weapon systems now, they involve very sophisticated technology, microelectronics, computers, lasers, fiber optics, all of which have civilian applications. So indeed, should peace break out tomorrow, it would be a boon to the economy, and the defense industries really wouldn't suffer that much because it would be a fairly easy conversion.
Well, that's an interesting point. Mary, in continuing to talk about conversion, I remember a few years ago the Pantex plant in Amarillo was in the news, and in some of the debate and discussion that was generated around that, an economist on the faculty of the University of Texas at Arlington, Dr. Dumas, was all for this theory. And I was wondering, especially in light of what Tom has just said, are any of the peace groups seeing that as something they need to be actively pursuing to try to reduce the number of military installations?
Well, I don't think any of the peace groups at the moment are actively doing that. We've all heard Professor Dumas speak and have read some of his articles. I think that it is a challenge for the economists as well as the politicians and the military, and the Defense Department to size up or to come to the, to make up their minds as to how much we really need of military spending. I think I'd agree with Tom that we shouldn't spend too much. I think it seems to me that too much is now being spent for defense, and that we should be channeling some of those resources to more job-intensive occupations, as Bill Coffin said. If housing and education and health and the transit systems all would employ more people, and they would be making and providing services which we immediately need. Now, we may have, we obviously would have disagreement on, how much we need for national security.
Well, I'm sure that is a question that there would be a variety of opinions on, but I'd like to get into an area when we talked about the Pantex plan, and there was a Roman Catholic bishop in that area that was very outspoken about that, and the Roman Catholic bishops and the United Methodist Church bishops have both issued statements on peace. They have, in a collective voice, issued a statement, and I'd like to talk about that a little, particularly as you all have been a part of hearing that and here in Austin. Tom, in the United Methodist Church, what was the purpose of the bishop's statement, and what were some of the results of that statement here, say in your congregation or in our connection in Austin?
Well, the bishop's statement, which was called In Defense of Creation, was meant as a statement about the difficulties in which we find ourselves with nuclear weapons and trying to suggest ways out of that. The bishop's statement, quite honestly, created some fair amount of debate within the Methodist Church, both locally and nationally. There have been surveys done by various groups which have shown that the average Methodist layman is far more conservative than the average Methodist bishop, if there be such a thing.
I wouldn't doubt that.
And as a consequence, this has generated a fair amount of debate within the church, which I find, frankly, kind of healthy and at least entertaining.
Well, Mary, the Roman Catholics pastoral came out first, I believe, and what were 2 or 3 points? You're probably familiar with both of the documents. Are there similarities? What are some of the points that the Roman Catholic bishops made?
Well, the Roman Catholic bishops went into the biblical, the Old Testament and the New Testament visions of peace, and came down very much, I love one of their pieces which I can quote, that peacemaking is not an optional commitment, it is a requirement of our faith. We're called to be peacemakers, not by some movement of the moment, but by our Lord Jesus. That if we are followers of Christ, who is the Prince of Peace, we should be searching for ways to make that peace a reality. Then they go into some of the difficulties of the whole, the political issue as it is at the moment, international relations. And they gave a sort of conditioned moral acceptance following statements that Pope John Paul II had sent to the Second Special United Nations session on disarmament, that deterrence could receive conditional moral acceptance while it was understood that there were continued negotiations going on for disarmament as soon as possible. It could only be temporarily accepted. The Methodist bishops in their pastoral in defense of creation considered deterrence a moral problem. That in other words, if you cannot morally, and both of the bishops said no to nuclear war, very definitely, and hoped that this country would make a statement of a no first use policy and quickly attempt to reduce, as the INF Treaty is now doing, reduce and eliminate the weapons. But the Methodist bishops very strongly made the point that if it's wrong to use them, it is wrong to possess them, or it is wrong to threaten to use them, which was what deterrence is.
So there was a difference in the question of deterrence. Did both of the bishops' statement touch on the theory of just war?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Because that's a problem. It is valid, and yet, I guess, with nuclear weapons in our midst, it changes that perspective. I guess that probably would be the context for a whole program. We may need to save that for another time. But Tom, can you quickly give us an answer about, does nuclear weapons tend to change the theory of the just war?
I don't believe so. I think from a theological point of view that if there ever was a just war, there still is. Because killing is never a question of numbers. If there's one casualty, that's one too many from a biblical point of view. I think where the two groups which we represent differ is in the order in which these things take place. If one reads in the prophets, you find that weapons are destroyed after peace is obtained. If you read in Isaiah and Micah, all the famous beating swords into plowshares, that comes after peace has been obtained. You don't destroy weapons to achieve peace. You achieve peace in order to be able to destroy weapons.
Well, we are rapidly coming to the end of our program, and I feel like it's unfair to not give Mary a chance to respond to that, but we'll have to have another whole program on this series. It's so good of you to both be here, and I congratulate you for the efforts that you're making. You're very articulate. Mary, I know you devote a lot of time, and Tom, you are very knowledgeable, and if you don't mind, I would like